Hello and welcome to Journeys and Journals. I'm Bernie Martin Beck and grew up here, love Southern Oregon, Northern California, and I get to meet the people who call this home. Even clear up to Portland now. We're expanding and it's pretty exciting. But today's guest is Elzie, and I don't know how you spell Elzie, but let's find out.
E-L-Z-I-E.
Okay, Elzie, where'd you get that name?
My dad gave me that one. I'm a junior.
Now are there, Elzie's not a name we know out here.
I would rather suspect that would be an Arkansas name because that's where my mother and dad were from.
Arkansas. Mm-hmm. What took you to Arkansas? What took the family there?
Well, I never did hear them talk about where they were before that. I rather suspect, looking at property lines, that the family originally came from Kentucky and then just kept going west. And Parkers, I guess, would spread so far and wide in one place. Well, we got to break this tribe up, and they'd all head for the next western state, which happened to be Oklahoma.
Elzie Parker.
Yeah.
And that's where you were born.
Yes, out in
Cromwell, weren't you?
Well, let's see. No, at Wetumpka.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, out in the house at Wetumpka. Back in those days, nobody had any money for hospitals, didn't have health insurance and so forth, and babies were born in houses. And you said where you were born by school districts, not by towns or anything of that sort. Unless, of course, you were a city dude. That's what we call guys like Carl, you know.
Let's meet Carl again.
It's good to see you again, Bernie. Thank you.
Carl Wilson, now how do you happen to know Elzie and introduce me to Elzie?
Yeah, well, the situation was that Elzie and my father grew up very close together in Oklahoma as boyhood friends. And so when you run it all the way to the end of the story, the two of them worked on radio in Grants Pass together for many, many years, 40 years or so together.
Now, Elzie, what did you know about radio?
Zip.
Did you have a razor blade and a tuning coil or something?
That's about as close, you know. But all outside of Jack Armstrong on the radio.
Okay.
And used to listen to that because the guy came on with Jack Armstrong, and man, you could hear him all over the house and everything, you know. So I got to watch Jack Armstrong for 15 minutes. Actually, as long as the commercials were, it amounted to about 12 minutes of Jack Armstrong.
Notice that this guy just said, watch it, because that was so vivid that you actually, in your mind's eye, put pictures in color to...
Oh, without any television to compare, I suppose the purpose of the memory situation was to complete the picture. In other words, you can hear it, but you got to see these people and what they're doing, you know, and that's what we did as kids.
I love it. I love it, because what was it like on that ranch or farm?
It was a farm. It was kind of a work situation thing. There were 3-4 of us boys that were of working age over most of my life that I remember.
No, you're talking 8, 10, 16, whatever.
Yeah, up from, say, 12 up to 18, you know, along in there. And you baled hay, you picked cotton, you shucked corn, that kind of thing. That was a farm life in those days.
Now, was that your farm, or?
Yeah, well, it was a farm that my dad rented. We didn't own the land. And of course, you didn't have a tractor. All you had was a team of mules and a team of horses, which drew the cultivators and the plows and the wagons and stuff like that.
You're saying a 12-year-old boy did some of this?
Oh, yeah. That was quite common.
Now, and do you have stories that fit right into this, Carl, by your dad?
I just grew up listening to those stories because these two were friends, and when they got involved in radio together here in Grants Pass, they wove a lot of those stories into what they were doing on the air. And that was part of the attractiveness of it, you know.
Of course, when you get down to it, guys my age, you know, above Carl's age, and here I am, 85 years of age, and people that are that old, we all came through pretty much the same routine. Because I would say as many as 60% of the people lived in the country and made their living from off the land and so forth. So that's all we knew, you know.
Well, now 60 years ago, you're talking about tough times.
Tough days, tough nights, tough weekends, tough months, tough years.
That sounds tough.
It was all kind of tough, right?
Either it was growing things that ended up dead if the hot sun or too much hail or the big wind.
Well, usually in the part of Oklahoma that we lived in, the rain was quite kind and very good, really. And you raise good crops just about every year. The only time that I remember that Dad and Mother had a problem with growing things was 1936. That was the year of the dust in Oklahoma.
Well, tell us about the dust.
Well, it blew in from the panhandle of Oklahoma and eastern Colorado and northwest Texas, and sometimes it would be so thick you could barely see the sun. You know, the sun was just a little round ball up there. You didn't see any rays moving out or anything like that. And of course it was hot. And I remember Mother would, when she would wash after a meal, wash the plates and everything, she'd put them back on the table and then put a cloth over the dishes to keep the dust from getting into the dishes.
What was your house like?
It was a good house. We had, I think there were 3 bedrooms, and of course...
Indoor plumbing?
Oh, no such thing as that.
Running water?
They hadn't even been invented yet.
As far as you know, not
so far as our house was concerned. But, I don't know, the things that I remember so much about those days had to do with Prairie View and talking about Jim's dad, or Carl's dad, Jim. We met in the 2nd grade, and the school it was 3-room school, Prairie View School, and this was back, way back there. I can't remember the date exactly, but the last time we visited that part of the country, and I was going to tell Carl that if I didn't tell him already, he's planning a trip back there one of these days, and the school that his dad and I went to, they've pushed it away with bulldozers and burned it or buried it or something like that. So all that's left of where the school was is a big cedar tree. And it was a little about like that when we went to school.
When you say big, you mean?
Now this big. You know, it has grown up. But I don't know. There were so many things going on and such happenings in those days that you kind of hate to even remember them anymore. And had I not appeared on your program here, why, I would not have heard anybody saying something about that time, as we say back home, on a coon dog's age, you know.
A coon dog.
Yeah.
Now, would that have come out on the radio? I mean...
Well, they talk like that all the time.
Yeah. Carl and his dad and... I forgot to mention a while ago, at the 2nd grade, I think I mentioned it before we came on the air, but we met, Carl's dad, Jim, we met during the while we were both in the 2nd grade. His dad and family, they lived at Castle up north of where we lived, and then they moved down pretty close to the schoolhouse. They only had a mile to walk. We had 2.5 miles to walk from our place. So
Now-
that's why I'm so slim and muscled up and all that sort of thing. You know.
Now, you walked in the snow
Oh yes,
and the rain
and the rain, yeah,
and the mud.
and the mud.
Carl, did your folks own their place?
What place were we talking about?
The neighbor place?
You know, I don't know if they owned it or not. Did they?
I think so. Yeah,
But-
your mother and dad owned their farm there.
But you were a sharecropper, kind
Yes,
of. Is that the right term? or-
Sharecropper, yeah, that
So
would be the term.
You're saying my family was rich?
Yeah, that's why I always like to go visit Carl, or his dad, Jim, because they were rich and owned all this land. I had a house and a barn and everything, you know.
Did they have flush toilets?
I don't remember that.
Rich takes on new meaning here
Yeah,
when we're talking.
yeah.
Well, now, you didn't stay there forever. What brought you out west?
Oh, well, let's see. You got any time left here?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
That's all about you.
Yeah. Well, the thing that got me out of the farm and so forth was World War II. Because, you know, if you're 17 years old, look out. You're getting ready to be drafted.
We want you.
Yeah, right.
I remember the poster.
And I tried to join the Navy a year before, when I was 16. You could get in when you were 16 then, but Mother and Dad would not allow that. And I ought to be glad that they didn't, I guess. But anyway, I was disappointed. But next year, when I was 17, they knew that the draft was going to get me, so they allowed me to join the Navy. And that's where the life that I pretty much recognize now begins, because you got out away from the farm and you were in the big cities and you're on a big ship and you're going here, going there, and all that kind of stuff.
See the world.
Yeah, I was on a flat top that airplanes landed on, flew off of, and aviation mechanic, and you watched after the airplanes and stuff like that.
That's your job.
Yeah. And
Where'd you learn that skill?
learned it on the ship. They, from other people, from other guys that would teach you and so forth.
I figured maybe you were back there fixing the column, the harvesters and things.
No, nothing. No thing such as that.
Well, now your dad went into what? He was in the military too.
Well, no, he actually he was in the Navy Reserve. Elzie, I think he had ear trouble that kept him out of active service, as I recall.
Yeah.
And so Dad spent most of his time working on ships in the shipyard at Swan Island in Portland. And so these guys were operating in different theaters during that time by a long ways.
There's an incident in connection with the business that Carl and I are in today, and I'm in it because of he and his dad. But on the flat top, I remember one day I'm up walking around, there are planes landing and taking off and so forth, and there's a guy over here with a microphone on I think he's on the starboard forward portion of the flight deck. And he's talking into this microphone. And I look down on the deck, and there's a little box down here, about like this. Anyway, after he finished his talk, I got to ask him, what's going on here? And he was a network reporter for somebody, and he had what we would call a tape recorder today, but actually it was a wire.
Really?
A
Yeah.
wire
recorder. Yeah.
Weird thing, that goes way back to when Carl first started in the business, a wire recorder, and you didn't see very many of those that day. And then they went on to a tape, and after the tape, that's still what they have and use in a lot of recording. It's tape recording. I thought that was kind of interesting to have remembered that, and I didn't think about it until you hit me up with the idea of being on TV.
Oh yeah,
So-
we've heard about them. I've never seen one, but that's a step above the groove on the disc that they. maybe it predated it. I'll have to find out. Because you're talking the radio, or that would have been radio, no TV, of course.
Right.
We're talking 1940.
2, 3.
And you
Actually, this was 1943.
you were in the Pacific Theater?
Yeah.
So you saw a guy with a microphone. Then what happens? You get out of the war, and there's a buddy of yours from 2nd grade,
Right.
and he says, did you get a phone call or a letter? Or?
Well, no, I was visiting him one weekend at McAllister. He was working at McAllister at that time. And I hadn't settled down to anything in particular at that time. And we got to talking, and he was telling me about John Brown University over at Siloam Springs, Arkansas, that they had their own radio station and taught radio, and you had the books on radio and the actual experience of microphones and doing radio. So we moved to Siloam Springs and went to the university, and that's how it all started. And they had in fact, they had a 5,000 watt radio station known as KUOA. Those were the call letters. Interesting story, I thought. It was purchased by the university from the University of Arkansas, which was in storage in a warehouse and catching dust. And I got to pursuing the story a little further, and the call letters KUOA, University of Arkansas, that's where that came from. They owned it originally, got dissatisfied with it, didn't know how to use it, and retired it and put it in a warehouse. And then John Brown University bought it and built a school around it and taught hundreds of radio people, you know. It was amazing.
You're talking roots here.
Yeah, yeah.
Broadcasting. So the two of you went to college. Did you have the GI Bill?
Oh yeah, GI Bill.
$190-some dollars?
I can't remember what it was, but
Real.
if you didn't have the GI Bill, you'd still be back on the farm picking up pecans and hoeing cotton rows, you know.
And that was tough.
You don't want that. You don't even want to talk about working with cotton, you know, either picking, pulling, or raising it, you know.
It hurts my hands just to think about those cotton bolls. Now, where did you get this come west, young man?
Actually, the main connection, or his dad, Jim, had just built the radio station here in Grants Pass.
KJO?
Yeah, KAJO. And we had maintained contact, you know, through the years and so forth.
Buddies do.
Yeah. I had done some work in the oil field, and he'd gone the radio route. And working in refineries and working in the oil field is no comparison to radio, because you stay clean and pretty and well combed and even brush your teeth once in a while and stuff like that. Like Carl.
Like Carl.
And so he called me one day from here, from KJO, and said he'd like me to come out and help him with the radio station.
Now, he'd bought this station for...
No, he built it.
Yeah, built it.
Yeah.
From nothing.
I mean, from the ground up, you know. And, well, let's see, how old were you, Carl?
I was 5 years old.
5 years old.
Yeah.
You know, I remember when we came out, I remember Carl, he was, had big smile. He was always grinning and always running. And he would run out there. What is it, Baker Drive?
Yeah, Baker Drive.
He lived on Baker Drive.
Yeah.
And we were outside visiting and talking and making plans and so forth. And he'd be running back and forth between us and over here, where there was a tree.
You lived on Dean Drive at that time, didn't you? We lived on Baker, so we were about a block apart.
Neighbors.
Yeah.
Neighbors. Now,
Excuse me, go ahead.
Keep going.
Oh, well, I was just going back to Carl. He did a lot of grinning and kid-like jumping up and down and running and all this
Nothing's
sort of thing.
changed.
Except now it's on a motorcycle.
Yeah,
Carl,
that's true. True. Yeah.
Well, then, grab the mic and tell us how it's done. This radio station was already a happening place, and it had this Arkansas flavor. Is that right?
It was refined. It was more Oklahoma.
Oh,
wasn't it?
yeah. We'd moved west. And Oklahoma, you know. Let's see, I usually did sign-on, I guess, didn't I?
Yeah.
And
Give us a try.
Jim, 6 o'clock in the morning is usually when we signed on.
Yeah.
And I'd come on something like, "Good morning, this is KJO, KAJO, Grants Pass, Oregon, authorized by the FCC in Washington, D.C. to broadcast on 1270 kilohertz," or some such thing as that, you know. And I'd get through that little routine, and then you jump in. Usually we always had the hymn of the hour, the first song of the day, yeah. And incidentally, we came on with the Lord's Prayer. That was the theme song that introduced the radio station. And then after I made my announcements and probably about a 6 or 8 minute newscast and weather forecast, then I'd play a hymn of the hour. And that went on for every hour throughout the day. Of course, we didn't have anything different than that. We played records and talked and had the hymn of the hour so far as a typical hour was concerned. And of course, progressively over the years, why the radio station has changed with time somewhat, which is appropriate because listeners change. Back, I don't suppose there would be any reason or any possible excuse for doing as Jim and I did when we first came on, because we talked about Oklahoma, and we talked about living on the farm, and we talked about all this oddball stuff that was associated with our lives. And there were a lot of folks out listening that did the same thing.
Yeah, that's very true, because you guys would talk about.
Yeah, give him the mic, okay?
You guys would talk about your mother's making soap and things like that, and you know, who around here can remember that kind of life anymore? So you were speaking to people who knew what that was all about. Yeah.
It's interesting to reflect on this, which I do once in a while. The listenership was so intense, and there were so many people involved with this new radio station that people would go downtown and, Jim and I, at that time, we'd always say, "Be sure and tell them KJO sent me," you know, to the at the end of a commercial, we'd say, "Be sure and tell them KJO sent me." So the next thing you know, I hear are people going down the street, down one side and up the other, opening business doors, looking in and say, "KJO sent me," and close the door and go on, you know. I thought that was kind of neat.
One of the things about KJO was how intensely you wove into our fiber and to community. You lived the station was out in a field, and the antenna was clear to the sky, it seemed.
Now we've got one that's 200 feet taller than that one.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
What's the story?
Well, you know, the thing is about what they did is they didn't put on airs. They were who they were. And people liked that, because I think that people were used to radio people or media people, even back then, putting on airs. And these guys did not do that. They acted like who they were, regular people. And I think they were really happy to have their jobs, because, you know, Elzie's talked about the farm life, Dad talked about the farm life, and they were glad not to have the farm life anymore. Yeah. And so they approached every day like, "Man, this is heaven. We love what we do."
The neat thing about it is that they did the legwork to get the advertisers, and it's all part of history. They'd knock on my dad's door and say, like to have an ad for Martin Studebaker.
That's right. Right.
You remember those days?
Oh, yeah, let's see. Henry was my account, yeah. And let's see, I visited Henry usually on Monday and got the commercial together for the ensuing week. And
Oh, my.
we would sit and chew the fat about this. I think, of course, Henry had such a neat, sweet life, just like you did, you know.
You mean because I didn't have any cotton to pick?
Yeah.
Oh, who's this guy?
I hardly remember that because there's hair on that picture. That's myself. That's 53 years ago.
And in your hand there,
That's a 45 RPM record. That's the latest thing. That's real modern stuff.
yeah, I think you better tell folks. It went on a cylinder like this, and
Yeah.
oh boy. Well, what do you want to say about this guy for all of us to remember?
Well, I tell you, this Elzie is like a second dad. I grew up with a couple of heroes, and my dad and Elzie, and they were synonymous. You didn't say one name without the other. And so when I was growing up as a 5-year-old and on into my teens, these guys were really like my dads, and they were my heroes. You know, Willie Nelson sings about his heroes have always been cowboys. Mine have always been radio announcers, and really typified by these two. And they did radio in a time far different than ours. But, you know, I have to say that so much of what we do today is just an updated version of what they did. Just good, sincere, solid radio.
Elzie, can you take that in and hear how much we appreciate you and what Big Jim did for us?
I can surely do that. And I appreciate it no end. And
Well, we sure thank you for coming to Better Life Television and letting us record some of your story the way it was. Thank you very much for being my guest.
It's our pleasure.
very much so.